The last photo on his camera wasn't meant to exist. Rocca Pernotto was 29 years old and worked as a freelance photographer who often chased strange stories across quiet rural towns. He preferred places that felt forgotten by time, where old buildings stood untouched and locals spoke in half-truths. That morning, he arrived in a small hillside village after hearing reports about a long-abandoned resort. The place had closed sometime in the early 2000s after what locals described as an unspecified incident. No official records explained what happened, but archived forum posts mentioned guests who checked in and never appeared again. Rocca was not the type to believe rumors without evidence, but he knew mystery attracted attention, and attention paid his bills. He parked his motorbike near a rusted gate, its hinges broken and hanging slightly off balance from years of neglect. The resort beyond looked frozen in time, with cracked windows and faded paint peeling from every visible surface. He lifted his camera and took a few establishing shots, documenting the entrance before stepping inside the property grounds. The air felt unusually still, as if the place absorbed sound instead of reflecting it back into the open space. A narrow path led him toward the main building, where the lobby doors stood half open, inviting but unsettling. He checked his phone signal, which dropped to nothing the moment he crossed the threshold into the building. That was not unusual in remote areas, but something about the timing made him hesitate for a brief second. Still, he pushed forward and entered the lobby, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through dusty windows. The reception desk remained intact, with old papers scattered as if someone had left in a hurry years ago. He began photographing everything methodically, starting from wide angles before moving closer to capture finer details. Each click of the camera echoed softly, but the sound seemed muted, as if absorbed by thick, unseen layers. Behind the desk, he noticed a ledger book lying open, its pages yellowed but still readable under the right light. Rocca flipped through it carefully, noticing names and dates written neatly, stopping abruptly near the final entries. The last recorded guest had checked in on a date written as 2008 with no corresponding checkout. He snapped a photo of the page, making sure the names and dates were clearly visible for later review. A faint noise came from somewhere deeper inside the building, like a distant footstep or something shifting slightly. He paused and listened, holding his breath to catch any follow-up sound, but the silence returned immediately. Rocca told himself it was just the building settling, something old structures often did after years without maintenance. Still, he decided to move toward the source of the noise, drawn by instinct more than logic at that point. The hallway beyond the lobby stretched longer than expected, with doors lining both sides at regular intervals. Some doors were slightly open, revealing dark interiors, while others remained firmly shut as if sealed from within. He chose one room at random and pushed the door open slowly, letting the light from the hallway spill inside. The room looked untouched, with a bed still made and a suitcase placed neatly near the corner wall. That detail made him stop immediately because abandoned places rarely preserved such personal belongings so carefully. He approached the suitcase and opened it, finding clothes folded inside, along with a passport tucked in a side pocket. The name inside did not match the last entry in the ledger, which suggested more guests had stayed unnoticed. Rocca felt a growing unease, but continued documenting everything, knowing this could become one of his biggest stories. He stepped back into the hallway and moved further in, noticing the air felt colder the deeper he went. Another faint sound echoed, this time clearer, like a door closing softly somewhere ahead of him. He raised his camera instinctively and began recording, switching from photos to video without fully realizing the decision. The hallway seemed to stretch longer now, though he was certain the building layout should not allow that distance. When he finally reached the end, he found a door that had not been visible from the earlier angle. It stood slightly ajar, with darkness beyond it that seemed thicker than the rest of the building. Rocca pushed the door open and stepped inside, his camera still recording every movement in front of him. The room was empty at first glance, but the temperature dropped sharply the moment he crossed the threshold. His breath became visible, which made no sense given the warm weather outside just minutes earlier. Then he noticed something in the far corner, something that looked like a figure standing perfectly still. He raised the camera toward it, trying to focus through the dim light, but the shape did not move at all. Rocca took one step closer, then another, each movement slow and deliberate as he tried to understand what he was seeing. The figure seemed to shift slightly, though it remained in the same place, like a shadow refusing to behave normally. Without thinking, he pressed the shutter button, capturing a single photo before lowering the camera instinctively. When he looked up again, the corner was empty. The figure was gone. Raka stood frozen for several seconds, his heartbeat loud enough to drown out any other sound in the room. He turned slowly, scanning every angle, but there was nothing else there except bare walls and silence. A sudden instinct told him to leave immediately, and this time he did not question it. He walked quickly back through the hallway, then faster, until he was almost running toward the lobby entrance. Once outside, the air felt normal again, and the weight pressing on his chest disappeared almost instantly. He leaned against his motorbike, trying to steady his breathing while convincing himself it was just his imagination. After a few minutes, he checked his camera to review what he had captured inside the building. Most of the photos looked normal, showing the lobby, the ledger, and the abandoned rooms exactly as he remembered. But when he reached the last photo he had taken, his hand froze mid-movement, because the image on the screen showed something he was certain had not been there when he pressed the shutter. In the corner of that empty room, the figure was clearly visible, and it was standing much closer to him than he remembered. Raka Pranoto stood beside his motorbike, staring at the final photo with a growing sense of disbelief and confusion. The figure in the image looked clearer now, its outline sharper than anything he thought his camera could capture in that light. It appeared human at first glance, but something about the proportions felt slightly off in a way he could not explain. The head seemed tilted at an unnatural angle, and the arms hung longer than they should for a normal body. Raka zoomed into the image slowly, his fingers unsteady as he tried to examine every detail without jumping to conclusions. The face was partially visible, but the features looked blurred, as if the camera struggled to fully register them. Yet the eyes stood out. They were dark, fixed directly toward the lens, as if the figure had been aware of him the entire time. Raka lowered the camera and looked back toward the resort building, now silent and unmoving under the afternoon light. For a moment, everything seemed normal again, almost enough to convince him that the photo was just a glitch. But he knew better. He had taken thousands of photos in difficult conditions, and he had never seen anything like this before. Instead of leaving immediately, he made a decision that would later feel like a mistake he could not undo. He went back inside, the lobby greeted him with the same stillness, but now it felt heavier, as if the building recognized his return. Raka kept his camera on, recording everything continuously as he moved past the reception desk again. He spoke quietly to himself, documenting his observations in a steady voice to maintain some sense of control. "This is a follow-up entry," he said, his tone controlled but tense, returning after reviewing the last photo taken. His voice echoed slightly, but the sound felt dampened, as if the walls absorbed more than they reflected. He walked back into the hallway, retracing his earlier path step by step while keeping the camera pointed forward. Nothing seemed different at first. The doors remained in place, the air still cold, and the silence unbroken by any obvious movement. But as he passed the room with the suitcase, he noticed something that made him stop immediately. The door was now closed. Raka clearly remembered leaving it open when he first entered, and he had not returned to that room since. He approached slowly and placed his hand on the handle, feeling a faint chill radiating through the metal surface. Then he pushed it open. The room inside looked the same at first glance, but the suitcase was no longer near the wall where he had found it. It now sat on the bed, perfectly centered. Raka felt a wave of unease move through him, stronger than anything he had felt earlier that day. He stepped closer and noticed the suitcase was slightly open now, as if someone had recently gone through it. He did not remember leaving it like that. Carefully, he lifted the lid. The clothes inside were no longer neatly folded, and the passport he had seen earlier was gone. In its place, there was a single photograph resting on top of the scattered fabric. Raka picked it up slowly, his fingers tightening around the edges as he brought it closer to his face. The image showed the same room, but it was not empty. In the photograph, someone was sitting on the bed, facing directly toward the camera, and that someone was him. Raka dropped the photo immediately, stepping back as if the object itself had burned his skin. He shook his head, trying to force logic into a situation that refused to follow any clear explanation. "This is not possible," he said under his breath. his voice breaking slightly despite his effort to stay calm. The sound of something shifting behind him made him turn quickly, his camera swinging toward the doorway. The hallway outside looked empty, but the door began to close on its own, slowly. Raka rushed forward and pulled it open again, his breathing now uneven as fear began to take control. He stepped into the hallway and looked both directions, searching for any sign of movement or explanation. That was when he noticed something else. The hallway was different now. The doors no longer matched the arrangement he had memorized earlier, and the distance between them felt inconsistent. It was as if the building had rearranged itself while he was inside the room. Raka turned back toward the lobby direction, but the path he had come from no longer looked familiar. Still, he started moving, choosing a direction based on instinct rather than certainty. As he walked, he kept recording, his voice now more urgent as he described every change he noticed. "Layout appears altered," he said, trying to stay coherent. "This was not here before. Doors are different. Spacing is wrong." His words came faster now, overlapping slightly as his composure began to slip. Then, from somewhere ahead, he heard it again. A soft sound. Not a footstep this time. Breathing. Raka stopped immediately, his body freezing as the sound became clearer in the silence around him. It was slow, steady, and close. Too close. He raised the camera and pointed it forward, his hand trembling as he adjusted the focus toward the darkness ahead. For a moment, nothing appeared. Then, something moved. A shape emerged from the shadows, stepping just enough into view for the camera to catch its outline. It was the same figure, but now it was closer than before, much closer. Raka took a step back, then another. Unable to look away from the thing standing in front of him, the figure tilted its head again, the same unnatural angle captured in the earlier photo. And then it took a step toward him. Raka turned and ran. The camera kept recording, capturing blurred images of walls and doors as he moved through the shifting hallway. Behind him, the sound of movement followed, not fast, but consistent, like something that knew it did not need to rush. Raka reached a corner and turned sharply, nearly losing his balance as he tried to find the lobby again. But instead of the entrance, he found himself back at the same door, the room, the one where he had taken the photo. He stopped, his chest rising and falling rapidly as the realization settled in. There was no way out. The breathing sound returned, now directly behind him. Raka slowly lifted his camera one more time, his instincts forcing him to document even in that moment. He turned just enough to capture what was there, and he pressed record, because this time, whatever was behind him was no longer trying to hide. Raka stood frozen at the end of the hallway, his camera raised as the sound behind him grew impossibly close. His breathing became uneven, but his hands stayed locked in position, driven by instinct stronger than fear itself. The camera screen showed a dim image at first, struggling to adjust as it tried to focus on the figure behind him. Then, the shape became clear. It stood just a few steps away, its form no longer blurred like before, but disturbingly defined in every detail. The proportions were wrong in ways that made his mind resist processing what he was actually seeing in front of him. Its arms extended too far, its posture slightly bent, and its head tilted as if studying him with silent curiosity. Raka tried to move, but his body refused to respond, locked between panic and something deeper that held him in place. The figure took another step closer. Its movement was slow and controlled, without any sound except the steady rhythm of breathing that filled the hallway. Raka forced his voice to work, though it came out strained and barely steady under the pressure of the moment. "What do you want?" he asked. The words quiet, but clear enough to break the silence between them. The figure did not answer. Instead, it lifted one arm slowly, pointing toward the camera still aimed directly at its form. Raka hesitated, his mind racing as he tried to understand what that gesture meant in the middle of his fear. Then something shifted, not in the figure, in the camera. The screen flickered briefly, and for a second, the image changed into something else entirely. Raka saw the same hallway, but it was empty. No figure, no movement, just silence, captured in a still frame that did not match what stood in front of him now. He blinked, and the image returned to normal, showing the figure once again, now even closer than before. Another step, Rocca stumbled back, his shoulder hitting the door behind him as he realized he had nowhere left to go. The handle pressed against his back, cold and unmoving. As if the door refused to open this time, the figure raised its arm again. This time, its hand moved slowly across the air, mimicking the motion of pressing a shutter button. Rocca's eyes widened as the meaning became clear. It wanted him to take another photo. Every instinct told him not to do it, but something deeper, something irrational, pushed him toward compliance. His finger rested on the shutter button. For a moment, everything went silent. Even the breathing stopped. Then he pressed it. The flash lit the hallway for a split second, illuminating every detail with unnatural clarity before fading instantly. When the light disappeared, the figure was gone. Rocca stood there, shaking, his eyes scanning the empty space where it had just been standing seconds earlier. The silence returned, heavy and complete. He did not wait this time. Rocca turned and forced the door behind him open, rushing inside the room without looking back into the hallway again. The air inside felt colder than before, but he ignored it, moving quickly toward the window on the far side. With effort, he managed to force it open, the frame resisting as if it had not moved in years. Then he climbed out. The drop was not far, but he landed hard, stumbling before regaining his balance and running toward his motorbike. He did not stop until he reached the main road, far enough from the resort that the building disappeared behind the trees. Only then did he slow down. His chest burned, his hands trembled, and his mind struggled to process what had just happened inside that place. After several minutes, he finally looked down at his camera again. He hesitated before opening the gallery, but he needed to know. The latest photo loaded slowly on the screen, pixel by pixel, as if resisting being revealed. At first, it looked like a normal shot of the hallway, empty, quiet, just like the brief flicker he had seen earlier. But then he noticed something, a reflection. In the far corner of the image, faint but unmistakable, there was a reflective surface he did not remember seeing before. And inside that reflection, the figure was still there, standing behind him, closer than ever. Rocca dropped the camera onto the ground, stepping back as if distance could somehow separate him from what he had captured. But the image remained burned into his mind. That night, he reviewed the video footage he had recorded, hoping to find something that made sense of everything. Most of it showed exactly what he remembered: the rooms, the hallway, the shifting layout that defied logic. But the final recording was different. It did not show him running, it did not show the hallway twisting or the door appearing again. Instead, it showed something else entirely. The camera had captured him standing still in the hallway, facing the empty space in front of him. For several long seconds, he did not move. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and waved, as if responding to someone standing just out of frame. Rocca stopped the video immediately, his heart pounding as a new realization settled over him with quiet certainty. He had no memory of that moment, none at all. In the days that followed, Rocca tried to continue his work, but something about him had changed in ways he could not explain. He avoided reviewing the photos again, but sometimes, without meaning to, he would catch a glimpse of them, and each time, the figure seemed slightly closer than before. No matter which image he opened, no matter how many times he checked, the distance kept changing, as if it was not trapped inside the camera at all, but slowly finding its placlove way out. The last photo on his camera wasn't meant to exist, because whatever it captured was never meant to stay inside it. A motel key was returned, but the guest never checked out. The motel key was found on the front desk early that morning, neatly placed beside the register without a word from anyone. According to the night audit report, the guest assigned to that key had never officially checked out. Rhett Koval was 36 years old and worked as the day manager at a roadside motel just outside a quiet highway town. He had taken over the morning shift that day, expecting the usual routine of checking rooms and handling late payments. The building was old but steady, with 12 rooms lined along a narrow walkway facing the parking lot. The motel rarely saw anything unusual beyond tired travelers and truck drivers stopping for a few hours of sleep before continuing long routes. Rhett liked that about the place, because it meant fewer problems and simple workdays that ended without surprises. That morning started the same way until he noticed the brass key tagged with room 8 sitting alone on the counter. It was placed carefully, almost deliberately, as if someone wanted to make sure it would be seen immediately. Rhett checked the logbook and saw that room 8 was still marked as occupied from the night before. The guest had signed in under the name Darius Venn, a man listed as 42 years old with no additional notes attached. Payment had been made in cash, which was not unusual for that location, and the stay was only booked for one night. Rhett remembered briefly seeing the man during check-in, but nothing stood out beyond his quiet demeanor. Rhett assumed the guest had simply left early and forgotten to notify anyone, which happened more often than expected in a place like that. Still, policy required him to verify the room before marking it vacant, so he grabbed the spare key and walked toward room 8. The morning air was cool and still, with only the distant sound of trucks passing along the highway breaking the silence around the motel. Rhett noticed that the door to room 8 was fully closed, with no signs of forced entry or disturbance around the frame. He knocked twice and waited, expecting no answer but following procedure anyway before entering any occupied space. When no sound came from inside, he unlocked the door slowly and pushed it open just enough to look inside. The room appeared untouched at first glance, with the bed still made and the curtains drawn exactly as they had been the previous evening. Rhett stepped inside and noticed that the air felt unusually cold compared to the hallway, as if the air conditioner had been running all night. On the small table near the bed, there was a single glass of water that looked recently filled, with condensation still visible along its surface. Rhett found that detail strange, because it suggested someone had been there not long before he arrived. He checked the bathroom next, expecting to find personal items or signs that the guest had stayed overnight as recorded. Instead, the bathroom was completely dry and unused, with clean towels folded exactly as housekeeping had left them earlier that day. Rhett walked back into the main room and looked around more carefully, noticing that there was no luggage, no clothing, and no sign of personal belongings anywhere. It was as if the room had been prepared for a guest who never actually stayed there. That was when Rhett began to feel a growing sense that something about the situation did not make sense in any normal way. He returned to the front desk and reviewed the security camera footage from the previous night to confirm what he remembered. The footage showed Darius Venn checking in shortly after 9 that evening, walking calmly to room 8 with a small bag in his hand. After that moment, there were no recordings of him leaving the room at any point during the night. Rhett watched the footage several times, focusing on every frame that showed the walkway leading to room 8 and the parking lot beyond it. No one entered or exited the room after that initial moment, and no vehicles left the parking lot during the night. The timeline created a problem that Rhett could not explain using any reasonable assumption based on his experience managing the motel. The key had been returned, the room was empty, and yet the guest had never been seen leaving. Rhett felt a quiet tension building as he replayed the footage again, noticing something small that he had missed before. At exactly 3:14 in the morning, the camera briefly flickered for less than a second before returning to normal. It was a minor glitch that could easily be ignored, but the timing made Rhett uneasy as he compared it to the rest of the footage. That brief interruption was the only moment during the entire night when the camera failed to capture the walkway. Rhett leaned back in his chair and stared at the monitor, trying to piece together a logical explanation that would account for everything he had seen so far. The returned key sat quietly on the desk beside him, its presence now feeling far more unsettling than before. He knew he would need to report the situation, but something told him that the answers might not be as simple as a missing guest or a forgotten checkout. Rhett Koval spent the next hour reviewing every second of footage again, hoping to find something he had missed earlier. The more he watched, the clearer it became that no one had walked out of room 8 during the entire night. He decided to call his supervisor, a regional manager named Coulter Haynes, who oversaw several roadside properties across the county. Coulter answered after a few rings, sounding distracted but attentive as Rhett explained the situation in careful detail. At first, Coulter assumed it was a simple reporting error or a missed frame in the camera system, which had happened before at older locations. Rhett explained the timing of the flicker at 3:14 and how it aligned with the only possible gap in visibility. Coulter paused for a moment, then told Rhett to document everything and avoid altering the room until someone else could verify the findings in person. He also instructed Rhett to contact local authorities, not as an emergency, but as a precaution in case something had gone wrong overnight. Rhett hung up and sat quietly for a few seconds, feeling the weight of the situation settle into something more serious than he first assumed. He reached for the phone again and called the non-emergency line, explaining that a registered guest had effectively disappeared without any trace. A deputy named Lorne Savid arrived roughly 40 minutes later, driving an unmarked vehicle and carrying a small notebook instead of any visible urgency. He listened carefully as Rhett walked him through the timeline, from the check-in to the return key and the empty room. Lorne asked to see the footage himself, watching it in silence while occasionally jotting down notes about timestamps and camera angles. When the flicker at 3:14 appeared, he leaned forward slightly but did not react in any obvious way. After reviewing the video, Lorne asked to inspect room 8 personally, making sure nothing had been moved or disturbed since Rhett first entered earlier. Rhett led him back down the walkway, unlocking the door again and stepping aside to let the deputy enter first. Lorne moved slowly through the room, examining surfaces and corners with a calm and methodical approach that suggested he had handled unusual cases before. He paused at the glass of water, noting the condensation that had not fully evaporated even after several hours. He then checked the air conditioner, confirming it had been set to a low temperature throughout the night, which could explain the slower change in the room conditions. Still, the lack of any personal items remained the most troubling detail in his assessment. Lorne asked Rhett about the check-in process again, focusing on the moment Darius Venn had signed the register and paid in cash. Rhett recalled that the man had avoided conversation, speaking only when necessary and keeping his eyes down most of the time. The description did not raise immediate suspicion, but it also did not provide any useful leads that could explain what had happened after that moment. Lorne requested access to the physical register, examining the signature and comparing it to known patterns he had seen before. He mentioned that the name could be false, which was not uncommon in roadside motels, where identification was not always strictly verified. Rhett felt a growing unease as the situation shifted from strange to potentially deliberate. Lorne then asked a question that caught Rhett off guard, wondering if anyone else had access to the master keys or could enter rooms without being seen on camera. Rhett explained that only staff had master access and none of them had been on site during the night shift. The night auditor had remained at the front desk the entire time, according to both the log and the camera footage covering the office area. That left no clear explanation for how the key had been returned without anyone approaching the desk. They walked back to the office together, and Lorne examined the counter where the key had been found earlier that morning. He asked Rhett to demonstrate exactly where it had been placed, noting the angle and position relative to the register. Rhett pointed to the exact spot, remembering how precise it had looked, almost like it had been carefully arranged rather than casually dropped. Lorne nodded slightly, then asked Rhett to pull up the camera covering the front desk overnight. The footage showed the empty counter for most of the night, with the auditor occasionally stepping away to check paperwork or use the back office. At 2:57 in the morning, the camera showed something that made Rhett lean closer to the screen. For a single frame, the key was not there, and then suddenly it was, resting in the exact position Rhett had found it hours later. There was no visible hand placing it, no movement entering the frame, and no indication of how it appeared. Lorne replayed that moment several times, slowing it down as much as the system allowed, but the result remained the same each time. The key simply appeared between frames. With no physical action connecting its absence to its presence, Rhett felt a chill run through him as he realized that the only two anomalies in the entire night were the flicker near room 8 and the sudden appearance of the key at the desk. Both moments were brief, almost easy to overlook, but impossible to explain. Lorne closed his notebook and looked at Rhett with a more serious expression than before, as if he had reached a conclusion he was not ready to fully share yet. He said that he would need to file a report and request further review of the footage by a technical team. Before leaving, Lorne gave one final instruction, telling Rhett not to rent out room 8 until the situation had been fully reviewed and cleared. Rhett agreed without hesitation, knowing that no ordinary explanation would make that room feel normal again. As the deputy walked out toward his vehicle, Rhett glanced once more at the monitor, where the frozen frame of the key sitting on the desk remained on screen. For the first time since starting his job, he felt that the motel was holding on to something it refused to explain. By late afternoon, the motel felt quieter than usual, as if the air itself had settled into something heavy and watchful. Rhett Koval kept the office lights on even as daylight filled the windows, unwilling to let any corner fall into shadow. Deputy Lorne Savid returned just before sunset, this time carrying a small evidence kit and a printed copy of the overnight footage logs. His expression was more focused than before, suggesting that whatever he had found needed careful handling. He told Rhett that a technician had reviewed the video files at a higher frame level, searching for compression errors or dropped data segments. According to the report, both anomalies were real events, not recording glitches or corrupted frames. That meant the flicker at 3:14 and the appearance of the key at 2:57 had both been captured exactly as they happened. There was no missing footage, no overwritten data, and no indication that anything had been altered after the fact. Lorne explained this calmly, but the implications settled heavily between them, leaving very little room for ordinary explanations. Rhett felt a quiet tension build again, the same feeling he had earlier, only now it carried a sharper edge. Lorne asked for one more walkthrough of Room 8, saying he wanted to check something he had not considered during the initial inspection. Rhett agreed, though a part of him already dreaded stepping back into that space. The hallway seemed colder as they approached the door, even though the evening air outside had not changed much. Rhett unlocked the door slowly, and both men stepped inside without speaking. The room looked exactly the same as before, with the bed untouched and the glass of water still resting on the small table. But this time, Lorne moved directly toward the wall near the air conditioner unit, where a narrow vent ran just below the window. He crouched down and removed the vent cover with a small tool from his kit, revealing a shallow cavity behind it. Inside, there was no wiring or ductwork beyond a short extension, just enough space for something small to be hidden. Lorne reached inside carefully and pulled out a thin envelope, sealed but worn along the edges as if it had been placed there in a hurry. He held it up without opening it immediately, studying the surface as Rhett watched in silence. The envelope had a name written on it in plain handwriting, the same name that had been entered in the motel register the night before. Darius Venn was written clearly across the front, along with a date from nearly 10 years earlier. Lorne opened the envelope slowly and removed a folded sheet of paper along with a small photograph that had faded slightly over time. The photo showed a man standing in front of the same motel, though the building looked newer and less worn. The man in the photograph matched the face Rhett remembered from the check-in, but the image quality and clothing suggested it had been taken many years ago. On the back of the photo, there was a short note written in uneven ink. It stated that the man had stayed in room 8 on that date and had planned to return for something he left behind. The note ended with a single line that made Rhett feel his chest tighten as Lorne read it aloud. "If the key is returned, it means I never made it out." Lorne folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the envelope, his expression shifting into something more measured and deliberate. He asked Rhett to pull up any archived records from the motel that might go back that far. Rhett hesitated for a moment, then returned to the office and accessed the older storage system that held scanned copies of past registers. It took several minutes to locate the correct year, but eventually he found an entry that matched the date on the envelope. The name Darius Venn appeared again, written in the same style, assigned to room 8 for a single night's stay. There was no checkout recorded, and a note beside the entry mentioned that the room had been found empty the following morning. Rhett felt the pattern settle into place, each piece connecting in a way that left very little room for doubt or coincidence. The same name, the same room, and the same unexplained absence, separated by nearly a decade. Lorne closed the file and looked at Rhett with a steady expression, as if he had reached the only conclusion that made sense given the evidence. He said that whatever had happened back then had not fully ended, and somehow it had repeated itself. That night, after Lorne filed his report and left the property, Rhett remained alone in the office, unable to bring himself to leave just yet. The motel was silent again, with only the faint hum of electricity running through the walls. He glanced once more at the monitor, where the camera feed showed the empty front desk and the walkway beyond it. For a brief moment, the image flickered, just like it had before, lasting less than a second before returning to normal. Rhett leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the counter, where something now rested in the exact same position as earlier that morning. The brass key to room 8 had appeared again, placed carefully beside the register. This time, Rhett did not move from his chair, and he did not reach for the phone or the spare key hanging on the wall. He simply watched the screen, understanding now that whatever had happened was not finished. Somewhere within the quiet structure of that motel, something was still checking in, still waiting, and still finding its way back to the desk. A taxi driver picked up a passenger, but the camera showed no one. The dashcam footage was recovered from a city taxi after a minor accident on a quiet suburban road. Investigators later confirmed the driver spoke to someone for over 20 minutes, yet the back seat appeared completely empty. Rian Percoso was 37 years old, and he had been driving a taxi for nearly a decade without any serious incidents. He worked late shifts because the streets were calmer, and the tips were usually better from passengers heading home after long nights. That evening started like any other, with light rain tapping softly against the windshield as the city slowed into silence. Rian checked his fuel, adjusted the mirror, and turned on the dashcam that recorded both the road and inside cabin. The camera had been installed a year earlier after a passenger dispute, and since then he rarely thought about it at all. Around 11:20 at night, Rian received a call through the dispatch radio about a pickup request near an older district. The address was vague, only mentioning a corner near a closed convenience store that had not been open for years. Rian hesitated for a moment because drivers usually avoided that area due to poor lighting and almost no activity. Still, a job was a job, and he accepted the request while turning the car slowly toward the quiet neighborhood. The streets grew darker as he drove, with fewer houses showing lights and more empty sidewalks stretching into the distance. When he finally reached the location, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the air heavy and strangely still. Rian parked near the curb and waited, glancing at the rearview mirror and then checking the empty sidewalk behind him. For nearly 2 minutes, nothing happened, and he considered canceling the ride and moving on to another location. Then suddenly, the rear passenger door opened with a soft creak, even though no one was visible in the mirror. Rian turned slightly, expecting to see someone step inside, but the seat remained empty from what he could tell. A faint pressure shifted the car slightly, as if someone had just sat down quietly without making a single sound. Rian froze for a second, unsure whether to speak or simply drive away from the unsettling situation unfolding behind him. Then, a voice spoke calmly from the back seat, asking him to drive toward an area across town near an abandoned bridge. The voice sounded normal, not distorted or distant, just like any passenger giving directions after entering the vehicle. Trying to stay professional, Rian nodded instinctively, even though he could not see anyone in the reflection behind him. He confirmed the destination out loud, and the voice responded clearly, repeating the location with steady confidence. Rian put the car into motion, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual as a quiet tension filled the cabin. As he drove, he occasionally glanced at the rearview mirror, but every time he checked, the back seat looked completely empty. The seatbelt was slightly pressed inward, as if something rested there, yet no figure or shadow appeared at all. Despite this, the voice continued speaking at intervals, sometimes asking about the fastest route or commenting on the weather outside. Rian responded politely, trying to act normal, though his heartbeat grew louder with each passing minute of the drive. At one point, he asked where the passenger had come from, but the answer was vague and avoided any clear details. The voice simply said it had been waiting there for a long time, which made Rian feel an unexpected chill run down his spine. 10 minutes into the ride, the atmosphere inside the car began to feel heavier, almost as if the air had thickened unnaturally. Rian noticed the temperature dropping slightly, even though the car heater was still running at the same steady level. He adjusted the mirror again, hoping for any sign of movement, but the reflection remained disturbingly unchanged. The voice then asked Rian if he believed in things that could not be explained by logic or simple human understanding. Caught off guard, Rian hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully as he tried to keep the conversation grounded. He replied that strange things happened sometimes, but there was usually a reasonable explanation behind them eventually. The passenger remained silent for a few seconds after that, creating an uncomfortable pause that filled the entire vehicle. Then the voice spoke again, softer this time, saying that not everything leaves evidence people are willing to accept. Rian felt his grip tighten again on the steering wheel as the road ahead led deeper into a darker, less familiar area. The destination was getting closer, and he could not shake the feeling that something about this ride was deeply wrong. Behind him, the seat still looked empty, Yet the presence felt undeniable, as if someone was sitting there, watching quietly. The road toward the abandoned bridge had not been used much in recent years, and most drivers avoided it entirely. Rian slowed the car as the asphalt grew uneven, with cracks spreading across the surface like veins in the dim light. The streetlights became scarce, leaving long stretches of darkness between each weak glow that barely reached the road. Inside the car, the silence returned, and the passenger had stopped speaking for several minutes without any clear reason. Rian considered ending the ride early, but something held him back, a quiet pressure that made him continue driving forward. He checked the mirror again, and the seat still appeared empty. Yet the seatbelt remained slightly indented as before. A few moments later, the voice returned, this time asking Rian to slow down as they approached a narrow turn. The tone had changed slightly, sounding more distant, as if the voice came from farther away inside the same space. Rian followed the instruction carefully, guiding the taxi through the turn while keeping his eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. Beyond the turn, the outline of an old bridge came into view, its structure barely visible against the night sky. The bridge had been closed for years after a structural inspection declared it unsafe for regular traffic and heavy vehicles. Warning signs were posted near the entrance, but many had fallen over or faded until they were almost unreadable. The voice then spoke again, telling Rian to stop the car just before the bridge entrance and wait for a moment. Rian hesitated briefly, but he obeyed, bringing the taxi to a slow stop as the engine continued idling quietly. For several seconds, nothing happened, and the silence felt heavier than anything Rian had experienced before in his life. He could hear his own breathing, steady but tense, filling the space where conversation had once been. Then, the rear door opened again with the same soft creak as earlier, followed by the subtle shift of weight leaving the seat. Rian turned quickly this time, his eyes scanning the back seat, but there was still no one visible anywhere inside. The door closed on its own, gently but firmly, as if someone had stepped out and shut it behind them with care. At that exact moment, the pressure on the seat disappeared completely, and the seatbelt returned to its normal position. Rian stayed frozen in place, unsure whether to move or call out, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. After a few seconds, he forced himself to speak, asking if the passenger had reached their destination safely. There was no response at all, only the faint sound of wind moving through the broken structure of the bridge ahead. Trying to regain control, Rian reached for the dashboard device to check the trip status recorded by the taxi system. The ride had already been marked as completed automatically, even though he had not confirmed anything manually. The fare displayed on the screen showed a full payment, but there was no record of a name or contact information. It was as if the system had accepted a passenger that did not exist, leaving behind only a completed transaction. Rian swallowed hard and decided to leave immediately, turning the car around with shaky hands and uneven breathing. As he drove away from the bridge, he avoided looking in the mirror, focusing only on the road back toward the city lights. Several minutes passed before he finally felt the tension begin to ease, though the uneasiness still lingered in his chest. He reached for his phone and called the dispatch center, explaining that something strange had happened during the ride. The dispatcher listened carefully, then asked him to return to the garage so they could review the dashcam footage together. Rian agreed without hesitation, wanting some kind of explanation for what he had just experienced firsthand. When he arrived at the garage, 2 staff members were waiting, along with a supervisor who handled incident reports. They led him into a small office and connected the dashcam footage to a monitor for immediate review. The video began normally, showing Rian driving through the city streets before arriving at the pickup location. Everything appeared exactly as he remembered, including the empty sidewalk and the quiet surroundings of the area. Then came the moment when the rear door opened, clearly visible from the interior camera angle facing the back seat. The door moved slowly, as if pulled by someone outside, yet no figure appeared entering the vehicle at all. The seat dipped slightly, just enough to show pressure being applied, even though nothing could be seen causing it. Rian could be heard speaking, confirming the destination with a voice that responded clearly from the back seat. Everyone in the room fell silent as the footage continued, showing Rian talking to what appeared to be empty space. The voice was captured clearly in the recording, calm and steady, matching exactly what Rian had described earlier. One of the staff members leaned closer to the screen, focusing on the seat, hoping to notice any hidden detail. But there was nothing there. No shadow, no reflection, nothing that could explain the presence heard in the audio. As the footage approached the bridge, the tension in the room grew, each person waiting to see what would happen next. Then, the rear door opened again on its own, and the seat slowly returned to its original position without resistance. The voice said one final phrase before leaving, captured clearly by the microphone inside the car. It said, "Thank you for bringing me back." The room stayed completely silent after the final words echoed from the speakers, leaving everyone staring at the screen. No one spoke for several seconds, as if they were all waiting for the footage to explain itself somehow. Rian felt a cold weight settle in his chest, because hearing the voice again made everything feel even more real. The supervisor finally paused the video, then rewound the last section slowly, focusing on the exact moment near the bridge. They played the final seconds again, watching the rear door open and close without any visible person entering or leaving. The audio remained clear, and the voice sounded calm, almost relieved, as it spoke its final line before disappearing. The supervisor leaned back and rubbed his forehead, clearly unsure how to respond to what they had just witnessed together. He asked Rian if he had noticed anything unusual about the passenger's voice during the ride itself. Rian thought carefully, trying to recall every detail, every word, and every pause that had filled the car that night. He admitted the voice sounded normal at first, but near the end it felt different, quieter, almost distant somehow. One of the staff members suggested checking older dispatch logs to see if that pickup location had any previous reports. The supervisor agreed, and they began searching through archived records stored in the system from past years. After several minutes of scrolling through outdated entries, they found something that made the entire room fall silent again. There had been a report filed years earlier about a missing person connected to that exact same pickup location. The report was brief, but it mentioned a late-night taxi request that never reached its intended destination across town. According to the notes, the driver at the time had claimed the passenger asked to be taken near the old bridge. However, that ride had ended very differently, with the taxi later found abandoned near the entrance of the bridge itself. The driver was discovered hours later, disoriented and unable to explain what had happened during that final trip. More unsettling was the detail that no passenger had ever been identified, despite the driver insisting someone had been inside. The case had eventually been closed due to lack of evidence, leaving behind only unanswered questions in the archived files. Rian felt his hands grow cold as he listened, realizing the similarities between that case and what he had just experienced. The same location, the same request, and a passenger that left behind no trace except for a recorded voice. The supervisor decided to compare the archived audio, if any existed, with the recording from Ryan's dashcam that night. After searching through stored data, they found a degraded audio file attached to the old incident report. The quality was poor, filled with static and distortion, but a faint voice could still be heard in the background. They played it carefully, increasing the volume just enough to make out the words without overwhelming the speakers. Rian felt his breath catch as the sound filled the room, because the voice was unmistakably the same as before. Even through the distortion, the tone and rhythm matched perfectly with the passenger recorded in his own car. The final words in the old recording were nearly identical, though partially lost beneath the static noise of the file. Still, the meaning was clear enough, and it sent a quiet chill through everyone listening in that small office. It had said something very similar, as if repeating the same journey again after all those years had passed. No one spoke after that, because there was nothing logical left to say about what they had just confirmed together. The supervisor eventually turned off the monitor and told Rian he could take the rest of the night off if needed. Rian agreed. Immediately, not trusting himself to continue driving after everything he had just seen and heard. He left the garage quietly, stepping into the cool night air as the city seemed strangely different around him. Over the next few days, Rian tried to return to his normal routine, taking passengers and following familiar routes, but something had changed, and he could feel it every time he checked the rearview mirror during a quiet ride. There were moments when the seat looked just slightly off, as if it held a shape that disappeared when he focused. The feeling never stayed long, but it was enough to remind him of that night near the abandoned bridge. Weeks later, Rian made a decision that surprised even himself, choosing to drive back to that location once more. He told no one about it, not the dispatcher, not his coworkers, and not even his closest friends. The road looked the same as before, cracked and empty, leading toward the silent structure of the unused bridge. He parked in the same spot where the passenger had asked him to stop, turning off the engine this time. For a while, nothing happened, and the quiet felt almost normal compared to the tension he remembered before. Rian sat still, watching the dark road ahead, unsure what he expected to find or understand by returning there. Then, without warning, he heard the faint sound of the rear door unlocking behind him with a soft mechanical click. Rian did not turn around immediately, because part of him already knew what he would see if he looked. The silence returned once again, heavy and patient, as if waiting for him to make the next move. After a few seconds, Rian slowly reached for the door handle beside him, his hand trembling slightly with hesitation. He stepped out of the car and stood beside it, staring at the empty road while the night air remained completely still. Behind him, the rear door was now slightly open, just enough to reveal the dark interior of the back seat. Rian took a slow breath, then closed the door firmly without looking inside, choosing not to confirm what might be there. He returned to the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away without checking the mirror even once. From that night on, Rian never spoke about what happened again, not to anyone who asked or anyone who listened. But, according to dispatch logs reviewed months later, his taxi occasionally completed rides with no recorded passenger details. Each of those trips ended the same way, near the abandoned bridge, with a payment processed and no one seen entering. And in every recording, just before the ride ended, a calm voice could be heard saying the exact same words: "Thank you for bringing me back." A hiker found a campsite that was still warm. Started with a report logged late in the afternoon describing a campsite that felt recently abandoned, but no one was nearby. The detail that stood out to everyone was simple. The fire pit still held heat, like someone had left minutes earlier. Rylan Mercer was 32 years old and worked as a seasonal wildfire lookout stationed near a remote mountain range. He spent most of his days scanning tree lines and valleys, watching for smoke that might signal something dangerous before it spread. That morning had been routine, with clear skies and steady wind drifting through the ridges without any sign of trouble. Rylan decided to take a short hike down a lesser-used trail, hoping to check a spot where campers sometimes stopped overnight. The trail itself was narrow and uneven, with patches of loose rock that shifted underfoot if someone moved too quickly. About an hour into the hike, he noticed something unusual ahead: a faint trail of smoke rising between the trees. It was thin and almost invisible at first, blending with the sunlight that filtered down through the tall pine branches. Rylan slowed his pace and adjusted his path, stepping carefully toward the source while listening for any movement nearby. As he got closer, the smell became clearer, not like a wildfire, but like a controlled campfire that had not fully burned out. He stepped into a small clearing and immediately saw the campsite set up in a way that suggested someone had planned to stay. A small tent stood near the edge of the clearing, partially zipped, with no visible damage or signs of forced entry. Next to it sat a backpack, leaning against a log, along with a pair of boots placed neatly side by side. The fire pit in the center still glowed faintly, with embers pulsing under a thin layer of ash that hadn't cooled yet. Rylan crouched near the fire and extended his hand cautiously, feeling the warmth rising steadily from the coals. This was not a fire that had burned out overnight. It was recent, very recent, and that made the silence unsettling. He stood up and called out, his voice echoing lightly through the trees, but there was no response from anywhere nearby. "Hello, anyone here?" he said, again, louder this time, expecting at least some movement or acknowledgement. Nothing answered him, not even the sound of footsteps or branches shifting in the surrounding forest. Rylan moved toward the tent and hesitated before touching it, unsure if someone might still be inside, resting quietly. He unzipped it slowly and looked in, finding a sleeping bag that was still slightly compressed, like it had been used recently. There were no personal items scattered around. Everything seemed organized, as if the person had stepped away intentionally. He stepped back and scanned the ground, looking for footprints or signs of direction, but the soil was too dry to hold detail. The only clear marks were near the fire pit, where someone had recently stirred the coals or added small pieces of wood. Rylan's radio crackled softly at his side, breaking the silence, but it was just routine chatter from the lookout station above. He picked it up and considered calling in the situation, but paused, unsure if this was an emergency or just a strange coincidence. Then he noticed something else that didn't fit. A metal cup sitting near the fire with liquid still inside it. He leaned down and touched the side of the cup, and it was warm. Not hot, but definitely not cold either. That detail shifted everything in his mind because it meant whoever had been here had left very recently, within minutes. Rylan stood still and listened again, this time focusing harder, trying to detect anything out of place in the surrounding woods. At first, there was nothing, just the soft movement of wind through branches and distant birds calling to each other. Then, faintly, he heard something else, a subtle sound that didn't belong to nature, like a step on dry leaves. He turned quickly toward the direction of the noise, his eyes scanning the trees, trying to catch even the slightest movement. But the forest looked empty, completely still, as if nothing had been there at all. Rylan tightened his grip on the radio and spoke into it, keeping his voice controlled but firm. "I found a campsite off Ridge Trail. Recent activity, no occupants in sight. Requesting guidance on next steps." The response came after a brief pause, calm but curious, asking him to remain on site and gather more details if possible. Rylan acknowledged and clipped the radio back to his belt, then took a slow step toward the edge of the clearing. He didn't know why, but the feeling in his chest had changed. Something about the place felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. The warmth of the fire, the order of the campsite, and the complete absence of its owner didn't make sense together. And as he stood there, listening carefully, he realized the forest itself had gone quiet, unnaturally quiet, like it was waiting. The silence in the clearing deepened, pressing in around Rylan as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He stood still for several seconds, listening carefully, trying to separate normal forest sounds from something that felt out of place. Nothing moved, yet the absence of noise felt louder than anything he had heard earlier that afternoon on the trail. Rylan stepped slowly toward the tree line, his boots crunching lightly against the dry ground despite his effort to stay quiet. He scanned the area again, this time focusing on the spaces between the trees where shadows could easily hide movement or figures. The campsite behind him still felt active, like someone had just stepped away and could return at any moment without warning. He crouched near the edge of the clearing and examined the ground more closely, hoping to find any sign of direction. There were faint impressions this time, shallow marks leading away from the camp, almost invisible unless viewed at the right angle. The marks were inconsistent, as if whoever made them had been walking carefully or possibly trying not to leave a trail. Rylan followed the line slowly, taking cautious steps, keeping the campsite within view as long as possible behind him. After several meters, the trail became clearer, a narrow path bending slightly downhill toward a denser section of forest. He paused and spoke quietly into his radio again, updating his position and describing the direction of the tracks he was following. The voice on the other end acknowledged and advised him to proceed carefully, but not to stray too far without backup. Rylan agreed, though he already felt he had gone far enough to make turning back difficult without answers. The forest ahead looked darker, with thicker branches blocking out much of the remaining daylight filtering through the canopy. As he moved forward, the air seemed cooler, and the scent of smoke faded, replaced by the damp smell of soil and moss. Then he saw something ahead, a piece of fabric caught on a low branch, barely visible against the shadowed background. Rylan approached slowly and reached out, pulling the fabric free with a careful motion that didn't disturb the surrounding leaves. It was a torn strip from a jacket or shirt, still slightly damp, though he couldn't tell if it was from sweat or something else. He held it closer, inspecting the edges, which looked torn rather than cut, suggesting sudden movement or force. Rylan felt his chest tighten slightly, the situation no longer feeling like a simple case of someone stepping away from camp. He looked around again, turning in a slow circle, trying to sense if he was being watched from somewhere just out of sight. The same quiet pressed in around him, but now it felt heavier, like something hidden just beyond the limits of his vision. A sudden sound broke through the stillness, louder than before, the unmistakable crack of a branch snapping under weight. Rylan spun toward the noise instantly, raising his voice without thinking. "Hey, I know you're out there. This is a lookout officer. You need to respond right now." The words echoed through the trees, but again, no voice answered him, only the faint rustling of leaves settling back into place. His radio buzzed again, the dispatcher asking him to confirm what he had heard and whether he had visual contact. Rylan responded quickly, describing the sound and his current position, while keeping his eyes locked on the direction of the noise. He took a step forward, then another, moving toward where the branch had snapped, each movement more deliberate than the last. The ground sloped slightly downward, and the trees grew closer together, narrowing his field of view with every step. Then he saw it, something lying partially hidden behind a fallen log just ahead of him. At first, it looked like a bag or gear, but as he moved closer, the shape became more distinct and far more concerning. It was another backpack, similar in size to the one at the campsite, but this one was unzipped and partially emptied. Items were scattered around it, a flashlight, a map, and what looked like a small handheld camera lying on its side. Rylan knelt beside the pack and picked up the camera, noticing immediately that it was still powered on. The screen flickered faintly, displaying a paused recording, the last frame frozen in place as if waiting to be continued. He hesitated for a moment, then pressed the playback button, unsure of what he was about to see. The footage began with shaky movement. The camera pointed toward the campsite, capturing the same clearing he had just left behind. A voice could be heard in the recording, low and uneasy, speaking quickly as if trying to process something unexpected. "I don't know what that is, but it's been watching the camp for at least 10 minutes now." Rylan's grip tightened on the camera as the footage shifted suddenly, turning toward the tree line at the edge of the clearing. For a brief moment, something appeared between the trees, not clearly visible, but enough to suggest a figure standing still. Then the recording jolted violently, the camera dropping as the person holding it began to run. The sound of heavy breathing filled the audio, along with footsteps crashing through brush, moving fast and without direction. The video ended abruptly, cutting to black, without any clear conclusion or sign of what had happened next. Rylan lowered the camera slowly, his mind racing, trying to piece together what he had just witnessed. The warm campsite, the missing camper, the hidden trail, and now this recording all pointed to something far more serious. And as he knelt there in the quiet forest, one realization settled heavily in his thoughts. Whatever had been watching that campsite might still be out there, and it might now be watching him. Rylan stayed crouched beside the scattered gear, his eyes fixed on the dark space between the trees where the footage had pointed. The forest remained still, but now every shadow seemed deeper, every branch shaped into something that could move at any second. He placed the camera back into the open backpack, then stood slowly, keeping his movements controlled and deliberate to avoid noise. His radio buzzed again, the dispatcher asking for an update, their tone sharper now after the delay in his response. "I found a second pack and a recording," Rylan said, keeping his voice steady despite the tension building in his chest. "There may be someone else out here, and they were being followed," he added, choosing his words carefully as he scanned the area. The dispatcher paused briefly, then instructed him to return to the campsite and wait for additional personnel to arrive. Rylan hesitated for a moment, glancing deeper into the forest, then turned back, deciding it was the safest option. As he retraced his steps, the path felt longer than before, the quiet around him now carrying a constant sense of pressure. Each footstep sounded louder, and he found himself checking behind him more often than he wanted to admit. When he reached the clearing again, the campsite looked exactly as he had left it, unchanged and still eerily intact. The fire still held a faint glow, though weaker now, the warmth fading as time passed without anyone tending it. Rylan moved toward the center of the clearing and positioned himself where he could see all sides without obstruction. He unhooked his radio and kept it in his hand, ready to respond instantly if anything changed around him. Minutes passed slowly, stretching into something that felt much longer, as the daylight began to fade behind the trees. Then he heard it again, the same subtle movement from earlier, this time closer, circling the edge of the clearing. Rylan turned toward the sound, his posture tightening, his voice firm as he called out once more. "I know you're out there. You need to come into the open now," he said, his tone carrying both authority and urgency. For a moment, nothing happened, and he wondered if the sound had been nothing more than his imagination playing tricks. Then a figure stepped partially into view between two trees, just enough to break the line of shadow. It was a person, but something about the way they moved felt wrong, slow and uneven, like they were struggling to stay upright. Rylan took a cautious step forward, lowering his voice slightly. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here to help. You can come out," he said, trying to keep the situation calm. The figure shifted again, stepping further into the clearing, revealing torn clothing and dirt smeared across their arms and face. It was a man, roughly mid-30s, his expression distant, his eyes unfocused as if he had not fully returned from somewhere else. Rylan approached carefully, stopping a few steps away, keeping enough distance in case the man reacted unpredictably. "Are you alone out here? What happened?" Rylan asked, his voice steady but softer now. The man didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting past Rylan, scanning the trees behind him with quiet panic. "It doesn't stop watching," the man said finally, his voice hoarse and strained from exhaustion or fear. Rylan glanced over his shoulder instinctively, then looked back at the man. "Who doesn't stop watching?" he asked, trying to ground the conversation in something clear. The man shook his head slowly, as if the answer didn't fit into words he could explain. "It stays just far enough, never close, never gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. Rylan felt the unease return stronger than before, but he pushed it aside, focusing on getting the man to safety. "You need to come with me. We're heading back up to the lookout station," Rylan said, extending a hand cautiously. The man stared at the offered hand for a moment, then reached out slowly, his movements hesitant but deliberate. As soon as their hands met, a loud crack echoed from the far side of the clearing, much closer than any sound before. Both of them turned instantly toward the noise, their attention locked on the dense trees where the sound had come from. For a brief second, Rylan thought he saw something move between the trunks, too large to be an animal, too fast to identify. The man tightened his grip suddenly, his voice shaking. "It knows you can see it now," he said, panic rising sharply in his tone. Rylan didn't respond, his focus shifting entirely to getting them out of the clearing as quickly as possible. He guided the man toward the trail, moving fast but controlled, not wanting to trip or lose direction in the fading light. Behind them, the forest remained quiet again, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. They reached the trail and began the ascent back toward the lookout station, their pace steady despite the uneven ground. Rylan kept listening as they moved, expecting another sound, another sign, but nothing came. By the time they reached the ridge, the last light of day had almost disappeared, leaving the forest in deep shadow below. Rescue teams arrived later that evening, responding to Rylan's report and escorting both men safely back to base. The campsite was investigated the following day, along with the surrounding area where the second backpack had been found. According to the official report, no additional persons were located, and no signs of wildlife activity explained the events. The recording recovered from the camera was logged as evidence, though no clear figure could be confirmed in the footage. The man found in the clearing was treated for dehydration and shock, but he never gave a detailed account of what he saw. He repeated the same phrase in multiple interviews, always with the same quiet certainty that unsettled everyone involved. "It stays just far enough, never close, never gone." Rylan returned to his post after several days, but he avoided that trail, choosing other routes for routine checks. He never spoke publicly about what he thought he saw between the trees that evening, or what he believed had been watching. But according to dispatch logs, one detail remained unchanged in every version of his report. The campsite had still been warm when he found it, as if whoever left had only just stepped away and was still nearby. A bus driver picked up a passenger who wasn't on any route. Rylan Cade had been driving the same late-night bus route through the outer industrial district for nearly 11 quiet years. Most nights felt identical, with empty streets, flickering traffic lights, and the low mechanical hum of the aging city bus. Rylan was 38 years old, a former delivery driver who preferred quiet work where nobody asked many questions. His shift always started just before midnight, when the last commuters disappeared and the city slowly folded into silence. That particular night began the same way, with light rain tapping against the windshield as Rylan steered through deserted intersections. The route was simple and predictable, a wide loop connecting an old factory zone with 3 quiet residential blocks. According to the printed schedule, the bus stopped at exactly 14 designated stops before returning to the central depot. Rylan knew every one of those stops from memory, including the broken bench near the freight yard and the empty lot beside Arden Street. Around 1:15 in the morning, the bus rolled past the final scheduled stop, which meant the next destination was the depot. The streets beyond that point were not part of any official route, and the company rarely sent buses there after midnight. Rylan eased his foot off the accelerator when he noticed a lone figure standing under a dim street lamp ahead. The man stood completely still beside the curb, his shoulders hunched slightly as rain drifted through the weak yellow light. At first, Rylan assumed the stranger was waiting for a taxi or simply sheltering from the weather. Still, the man raised one arm slowly, the universal signal people used when they wanted a bus to stop. Rylan frowned at the empty sidewalk around him because that intersection had never been listed on any company route. He checked the dashboard schedule again, even though he already knew that stop did not exist on the official map. The man remained motionless beside the road, watching the approaching bus with an expression that seemed calm and strangely patient. For reasons Rylan could not fully explain, he felt a quiet pressure to slow the vehicle. The bus hissed softly as the brakes engaged, and the folding doors opened with their usual mechanical sigh. The passenger stepped aboard without hesitation, bringing with him the cold smell of rain and damp pavement. He looked to be somewhere in his late 40s, wearing a dark coat that appeared several decades out of style. Rylan offered the routine greeting he used for every rider, keeping his voice relaxed despite the unusual stop. "Evening. Fare is $2. The man nodded once and placed 2 wrinkled bills into the fare box without speaking another word. Rylan noticed the passenger did not ask about the route or mention any destination. Instead, the man walked quietly toward the back and chose a seat beside the window near the last row. The bus pulled away from the curb again, its headlights sweeping across the empty warehouses lining the street. Rylan checked the interior mirror briefly, expecting to see the passenger settling into his seat. The man was staring straight ahead, not out the window, but toward the front of the bus. His expression looked distant, almost thoughtful, like someone replaying a memory that refused to fade. A few minutes passed as the bus continued toward the depot, rain tapping steadily against the glass. Then Rylan noticed something strange printed across the top of the passenger transfer slip. Every transfer ticket carried the current date automatically stamped by the machine inside the fare box. This ticket showed a date written in faded ink that read October 1993. Rylan blinked once and leaned closer to the dashboard mirror, trying to make sure he had read it correctly. The passenger still sat in the same seat, calm and silent, holding the small paper ticket between his fingers. Rylan felt a slow tightening in his chest as another thought quietly surfaced in his mind. The company had not even operated a night route through this district in October 1993. And according to the old depot records, the last driver assigned to that abandoned route had vanished during a shift that same year. Rylan Cade kept one hand on the steering wheel while his eyes returned to the mirror above the windshield. The passenger still sat near the back, holding the transfer ticket while staring toward the front of the bus. Rylan tried to convince himself that the strange date must be a printing error from the aging fare machine. The buses assigned to late shifts were older models, and their ticket printers occasionally jammed or stamped faded numbers. Still, the number on that paper looked clear and deliberate, October 1993, printed across the top line. Rylan glanced again at the quiet street ahead as the bus rolled toward the depot entrance. A narrow service road cut through the warehouse district before connecting to the main avenue near the company yard. Normally, Rylan would drive straight there, park the bus, and hand the vehicle to the maintenance crew. But something about the passenger in the back seat made him hesitate before turning toward the depot. He checked the mirror again and saw the man now looking out the rain-covered window. The passenger suddenly spoke, his voice calm but slightly hoarse from the long silence. "You passed my stop!" Rylan blinked in surprise and shifted slightly in his seat. "There are no more stops tonight," Rylan replied carefully. The route ended back on Arden Street. The man slowly turned his head toward the front of the bus. His eyes looked tired but focused, as if he already knew what the driver would say. "There used to be another stop," the passenger said quietly. Rylan felt a chill crawl along his arms, despite the warm air blowing from the heater vents. "What stop?" he asked. "The bridge stop," the man answered. Rylan searched his memory and frowned. There was a narrow rail bridge 2 miles away, but the company had removed that stop decades earlier. According to the older drivers at the depot, the bridge stop disappeared after a strange incident in the early 1990s. Rylan had only heard the story once during a break room conversation years earlier. A driver working the late shift reportedly radioed dispatch about a passenger who never exited the bus. When the vehicle finally returned to the depot, the driver was gone and the bus sat empty. No signs of struggle were ever reported, and the company quietly shut down that section of the route. Ryland swallowed slowly as the rain continued tapping against the windshield. "The bridge stop closed a long time ago," he said carefully. The passenger leaned slightly forward in his seat. "I know," the man replied. For a moment, the bus filled only with the sound of the engine and the steady rhythm of rain. Ryland's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Where exactly do you need to go?" he asked. The passenger lifted the transfer ticket again, studying the faded ink as though confirming something important. "The route always continued past the bridge," the man said quietly. Ryland felt a growing unease settle into the pit of his stomach. The passenger spoke about the old route as if he had ridden it many times before, but no one had traveled that line for over 30 years. Ryland glanced at the digital clock above the dashboard. It read 1:27 in the morning. That time felt strangely familiar, though he could not immediately remember why. Then the memory surfaced slowly from the conversation he once overheard in the depot break room. The missing driver from 1993 had radioed dispatch at exactly 1:27. Ryland felt his pulse quicken as the road curved toward the depot entrance ahead. If he continued straight, the shift would end in less than 3 minutes. But the passenger in the mirror was now watching him again. His expression looked calm, almost patient, as if waiting for Ryland to make a choice. Then the man spoke one final sentence. "The bridge stop is still there," he said softly. "You just have to drive the old road to see it." Ryland Cade slowed the bus as the depot entrance appeared on the right side of the road. The security gate stood open, glowing under a row of bright white lamps that cut through the steady rain. All he had to do was turn the wheel slightly, and the shift would end like every other quiet night. But the passenger's words echoed in his mind with unsettling clarity. "The bridge stop is still there." Ryland glanced at the mirror again. The man in the back seat watched him calmly, holding the old transfer ticket between two steady fingers. Something about the situation felt strangely deliberate, like a moment that had already happened before. Ryland exhaled slowly and drove past the depot entrance without turning. The narrow service road continued straight into the darker section of the industrial district. Streetlights became sparse as the bus moved farther from the main avenue. After several minutes, the warehouses disappeared, replaced by thick trees growing along an abandoned rail line. The road ahead curved toward a narrow steel bridge that crossed a shallow river. Ryland had never driven this part of the district during his 11 years on the job. Yet the passenger behind him seemed completely certain about where the road would lead. Rain drummed steadily on the bus roof as the headlights illuminated the old bridge structure. The metal frame looked rusted and worn, barely visible beyond the mist rising from the river. Then Ryland noticed something unexpected beside the road. A bus stop sign stood near the entrance of the bridge. The metal pole leaned slightly to one side, and the faded transit logo barely showed through layers of peeling paint. Ryland felt his chest tighten as the bus rolled closer. The stop looked abandoned for decades, yet it still stood exactly where the passenger described. Without speaking, Ryland pressed the brake pedal and the bus slowed beside the sign. The doors opened with their usual mechanical hiss. For a moment, neither man moved. Then the passenger stood and walked slowly toward the front. The bus floor creaked softly beneath his shoes. When he reached the driver's seat, he paused beside Ryland. Up close, the man looked older than Ryland first believed, his face lined with quiet exhaustion. But his expression carried a strange sense of relief. "Thank you for coming back," the passenger said calmly. Ryland frowned slightly. "What do you mean, coming back?" The man studied the driver for a moment before answering. "Drivers stopped coming this way after that night," he explained quietly. Ryland felt a cold wave move through his body. "What night?" he asked. The passenger held up the transfer ticket again. "The night the last bus arrived here," he said. Ryland's eyes drifted toward the faded date printed across the small piece of paper. October 1993. The same date from the old story he once heard inside the depot break room. Ryland looked back at the passenger. "You were on that bus?" The man nodded slowly. "There were two of us," he replied. "The driver and the last passenger." Ryland waited for the rest of the explanation, but the man simply turned toward the open doors. Rain drifted softly through the entrance as the river moved quietly beneath the bridge. The passenger stepped down onto the wet pavement. Then he paused beside the door and looked back at Ryland one final time. "The driver never finished the route," the man said. "He never brought the passenger to the bridge stop." Ryland felt the meaning of those words settle slowly into place. "You waited all this time," he said quietly. The passenger gave a small nod. Then he stepped away from the bus and walked toward the dark bridge. Within seconds, his figure disappeared into the mist hanging above the river. Rylan remained frozen behind the wheel, listening to the rain and the steady hum of the engine. After a moment, he reached forward and closed the doors. The bus pulled away from the old stop and turned back toward the distant depot lights. When Rylan finally parked inside the yard, the night supervisor approached the vehicle with a clipboard. "You ran a little late tonight," the supervisor said casually. Rylan hesitated before answering. "There was a passenger," he explained. The supervisor frowned slightly. "That is strange," he replied. "This route has been empty all night." Rylan looked down at the fare box beside his seat. Inside the clear plastic tray lay 2 wrinkled dollar bills and a single transfer ticket. The paper still showed the faded date from October 1993. Rylan never saw the passenger again. But every late shift after that night, he slowed slightly whenever the road curved toward the old bridge. Because sometimes, just before 1:27 in the morning, he thought he could see someone standing beside that forgotten bus stop. One line in the dispatch log changed the case. The case would later be defined by a single sentence typed during a quiet overnight shift. At the time, it looked like nothing more than routine documentation from a call that felt ordinary. The call came in just after 12:30 in the morning, when the county usually went silent. Maribel Crane had been a dispatcher for nearly 13 years, and she trusted patterns more than instincts. Most serious emergencies announced themselves clearly, with panic, noise, and urgency spilling through the line. This call did not. The man who called sounded winded but controlled, like someone trying to sound calm on purpose. He said he was driving home when his headlights caught a pickup truck down in a roadside ditch. The vehicle sat nose forward at an odd angle, with no lights on and no movement inside. Maribel asked for his location, and he hesitated before answering. He gave a mile marker, then corrected himself, then mentioned a service road nearby. She typed carefully, noting the changes without commenting on them. He said he walked up to the truck and looked through the driver's window. There was blood on the steering wheel, dark and dried in places. The driver was slumped forward, seatbelt on, and not responding. Maribel asked if he had checked for breathing. The man said no, he did not want to touch anything. His voice tightened slightly when he said it, then smoothed out again. She dispatched a patrol unit and volunteer medics, classifying the call as a single vehicle accident. As she worked through the checklist, she kept listening to the background noise on the line. There was wind, distant traffic, and nothing else. Just before hanging up, the man added something she had not asked about. He said the crash must have happened hours earlier because nobody else was around. Maribel paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She asked him why he thought the crash was old. The man hesitated, then said the truck just looked like it had been there a while. That answer felt thin, but not thin enough to challenge. Maribel asked one more question, keeping her tone neutral. She asked if the engine felt cold. The man said no, the engine was warm. There was a brief silence after that, the kind that lingered longer than expected. Maribel typed as he spoke, documenting the contradiction without comment. Caller reports engine warm despite belief crash occurred hours earlier. She closed the call and moved on, already answering another line. In her experience, small inconsistencies were common and usually meaningless. 11 minutes later, Deputy Alric Boone arrived at the scene. He was nearing the end of a long shift and hoped for a quick resolution. What he saw matched the report closely enough to satisfy him. The driver was identified as Roland Ives, age 46, a local mechanic. He was slumped forward in the seat with a visible head wound near his hairline. There were no skid marks, no broken signs, and no debris scattered across the road. The medic confirmed death at the scene, estimating it had occurred sometime earlier. With no obvious signs of foul play, the incident was logged as non-suspicious. The truck was towed, photos were taken, and traffic flowed again. By sunrise, the case was already settling into paperwork. It looked like another lonely death on a forgotten stretch of road. No witnesses, no clear cause, and no reason to look twice. Maribel returned for her next shift that night and barely remembered the call. The dispatch log remained unchanged, one line sitting quietly among dozens of others. 2 days later, that line would be read again, and nothing would be routine after that. 2 days after the crash, the file reached an investigator who did not trust summaries. Halden Pierce was 51, methodical, and known for rereading what others skimmed once. He believed most mistakes lived in margins, timestamps, and sentences people assumed were harmless. He read the report front to back, then opened the dispatch log. That was where he stopped. The line about the warm engine did not fit the timeline at all. If the crash happened hours earlier, the engine should have been cold. If the engine was warm, then the crash was recent or the truck was run afterward. Either option meant the initial conclusion was wrong. Halden requested the tow yard intake notes before doing anything else. The operator had written that the hood felt warm when he hooked the truck. He also noted the radio was playing a local station that signed off overnight. That detail mattered. The station stopped broadcasting just after midnight. If the radio was still on, the truck had been running not long before discovery. Halden pulled traffic camera footage from the nearest working intersection. It was miles away, grainy, and rarely useful, but he checked anyway. He found a pickup matching the truck passing through 20 minutes before the call. That erased the idea of a crash sitting unnoticed for hours. Someone had either been mistaken or someone had lied. Halden reclassified the case and requested the original caller information. The name was Keaton Rule, age 32, a local delivery driver. His record included minor theft and a previous false report years earlier. Halden brought Keaton in for a follow-up interview. Keaton appeared cooperative, but his answers drifted under pressure. He repeated the story, then adjusted small details without noticing. He said he was driving home, then later said he was heading out. He said the truck looked abandoned, then said he could see fresh blood. When asked about the engine, he avoided eye contact. Halden asked him directly why he believed the crash was old. Keaton said it was just a feeling, nothing specific. That answer did not survive silence. Phone records placed Keaton near the area earlier that night. They also showed his emergency call came from several miles away. That explained why nobody saw him at the scene. While Halden waited on more records, the autopsy report arrived. The medical examiner noted blunt force trauma inconsistent with a steering wheel impact. The wound suggested a heavy object, delivered with force from close range. Halden visited Roland Ives's garage the same afternoon. The place was orderly, with tools aligned and labeled. One space on the wall was empty, the outline of a tire iron visible in dust. Oil stains on the floor showed a recent vehicle movement. The pattern suggested the truck had been driven after an abrupt stop. It looked less like an accident and more like cleanup. Halden brought Keaton back in for a second interview. This time, the tone changed. Halden laid out the timeline slowly, one piece at a time. The warm engine, the radio station, the camera footage, the missing tool. Keaton listened, nodding, breathing shallow, saying nothing. When Halden finished, he slid the dispatch log across the table. He pointed to the single line typed by a dispatcher he had never met. Halden asked Keaton if the engine was warm because he had just shut it off. Keaton swallowed hard and stared at the table. He did not answer. The room stayed quiet longer than most people could tolerate. When Keaton finally looked up, his face had changed, and Halden knew the case was about to break open. Keaton broke the silence by asking for water, then pushed the cup away without drinking. His shoulders slumped, as if he had been holding himself upright by force alone. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and steadier than Halden expected. He said he knew Roland and that they had known each other for years. They had worked together briefly at a repair shop before money ruined the friendship. Roland had accused him of stealing tools, and the argument never fully died. On the night of the crash, Keaton went to Roland's garage to confront him. He claimed he only wanted to talk, but the discussion turned heated quickly. Words turned into shouting, and shouting turned into something neither planned. Keaton said Roland grabbed a tire iron from the wall, not to swing it, but to threaten him. Keaton reacted without thinking, striking first and harder than he realized. Roland fell backward, hit his head, and did not get back up. Keaton said he panicked when he realized Roland was not moving. He checked for breathing, found none, and felt the weight of what he had done. Instead of calling for help, he made a decision he thought would save him. He dragged Roland into the truck, buckled him in, and wiped down the garage floor. He drove the truck out to the highway, choosing a spot he thought looked accidental. He eased it into the ditch, careful not to leave skid marks. He left the engine running longer than intended, then shut it off and walked away. After driving several miles, he called emergency services and pretended to discover the crash. He believed distance would erase connection and time would erase doubt. What he did not consider was habit. He did not consider a dispatcher trained to document contradictions without judgment. He did not consider how machines recorded things people forgot. The confession aligned cleanly with the evidence already gathered. Phone records, camera footage, tool placement, and injury patterns matched his account. The case moved quickly once the story stopped changing. Keaton was charged with manslaughter and evidence tampering. He accepted a plea agreement months later, avoiding trial and a longer sentence. The final paperwork was sealed, and the case faded from public attention. Maribel Crane learned about the outcome through an internal bulletin. Her name was not mentioned, and her note was not highlighted. To her, it was just another closed call from years earlier. She continued working nights, answering phones, and typing details others overlooked. She never asked what happened to the cases that passed through her hands. She only believed that accuracy mattered even when nobody seemed to notice. Halden Pierce retired several years later. When asked about cases that stayed with him, he mentioned this one quietly. He said the truth often hides inside sentences people rush past. The crash was never what it appeared to be. It was not solved by a dramatic discovery or a single bold move. It was solved because one line did not match the story it belonged to. Long after the files were archived, that line remained unchanged. A simple observation typed during a quiet shift. One line in the dispatch log that changed the case. A hiker found a warning carved into the canyon wall. In late autumn of 2017, a lone hiker discovered a warning carved deep into a canyon wall. By the time investigators understood what it meant, several strange details from that day had already become impossible to explain. Ronan Hale was 34 years old and worked long night shifts as a freight supervisor at a regional distribution warehouse. On most weekends, he drove away from the city, looking for quiet trails where he could hike alone and clear his mind. That Saturday morning, he headed toward a remote stretch of canyonland several hours outside the nearest town. The place was known to locals for steep walls, narrow paths, and long sections where cell signals simply disappeared. Ronan preferred trails that few people visited because crowded parks always made the experience feel rushed and noisy. According to later interviews, he packed water, a small camera, trail snacks, and a folded topographic map inside his worn hiking bag. The trail he chose that day followed a dry riverbed before bending into a deeper section of canyon. By mid-morning, the sun hung high above the cliffs, casting sharp shadows that stretched across the dusty stone floor. At first, nothing unusual happened, and Ronan walked steadily while taking photos of unusual rock formations along the path. Around noon, the canyon narrowed sharply, forcing the trail close to a tall wall of pale stone. It was there that Ronan noticed something strange, cut into the rock several feet above the ground. At first, he assumed it was graffiti left by climbers, which sometimes appeared in isolated places like this. But when he stepped closer, the markings looked older and far more deliberate than simple carved initials. The letters were deep and uneven, like someone had spent a long time pressing a sharp tool into hard stone. Ronan brushed dust away with his hand and read the words slowly, trying to understand what he was seeing. The message was short, only a single sentence carved into the canyon wall. It read, "Do not go farther. Turn back while you still can." At first, Ronan laughed quietly to himself, assuming the message was some kind of dramatic joke left by hikers. But something about the carving felt different, because the stone around the letters looked weathered and very old. The grooves held darker sediment that had settled over many seasons of rain and wind. It suggested the warning had been there much longer than the average trail marker or tourist graffiti. Ronan took several photos of the carving with his small camera before stepping back to examine the surrounding rock. There were no signatures, no dates, and no other markings nearby that explained who might have written the message. The trail continued deeper into the canyon, only a few yards past the carved warning. From where Ronan stood, the path curved slightly and disappeared behind a sharp bend in the stone walls. He checked his watch and considered turning around, mostly because the warning had unsettled him more than he expected. Still, curiosity pushed him forward, and the idea of a mysterious carving made the hike suddenly more interesting. Before continuing, Ronan scanned the ground carefully for footprints or signs of recent visitors passing through the narrow corridor. The dust looked mostly undisturbed, except for faint animal tracks weaving between scattered rocks along the canyon floor. No fresh boot prints appeared anywhere near the carved warning. That detail would later become one of the first things investigators wrote down in their notes. Ronan hesitated for another moment before lifting his camera again and recording a short video of the strange message. In the footage, his voice sounded calm, though later listeners noticed a hint of uncertainty in his tone. He quietly read the carved sentence aloud and joked that someone out there probably had a strange sense of humor. Then he turned the camera toward the trail ahead and began walking deeper into the canyon. For the next several minutes, the path remained silent, except for the steady sound of Ronan's boots against loose gravel. The canyon walls grew taller as he continued, blocking more sunlight and lowering the temperature noticeably. According to the timestamp on his camera footage, about 12 minutes passed after he left the carved warning behind. That was when Ronan stopped walking again and aimed the camera towards something farther ahead along the trail. At first, the video captured only stone and shadow, but then a shape slowly appeared near the base of the canyon wall. It looked like another carving, larger this time, etched into a darker section of rock several yards ahead. Ronan moved closer to read it clearly, unaware that the second message would soon make the first warning seem far less mysterious. Ronan Hale approached the darker section of stone with slow steps, holding the camera steady as he moved closer. The second carving was much larger than the first message he had discovered earlier along the narrow canyon trail. Unlike the first warning, this carving stretched across several feet of rock and looked hurried, almost desperate in appearance. The letters were uneven and deeper in some places, suggesting whoever carved them had worked quickly under pressure. Ronan stepped closer and wiped loose sand from the grooves with the side of his hand. The words slowly became clear as the dust fell away from the surface of the rock. The message read, "If you see this, someone ignored the first warning." For several seconds, Ronan said nothing, while the camera quietly recorded the carved sentence in sharp afternoon light. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than before, and the casual tone from earlier had disappeared. He muttered that the place suddenly felt less like a hiking trail and more like the beginning of a strange story. Still, he continued walking slowly toward the bend in the canyon where the path narrowed even further. Investigators would later review the camera footage many times while studying the sequence of events from that afternoon. At first, nothing unusual appeared beyond the two carved warnings and Ronan's calm but cautious reactions. But a few minutes after passing the second carving, something else entered the frame briefly near the canyon floor. The camera caught a glimpse of what looked like a rusted metal object, partly buried under layers of dust. Ronan noticed it immediately and crouched down to brush away loose gravel from the small exposed corner. As he cleared more dirt, the shape slowly revealed itself as a narrow metal box. The box looked old and heavily weathered, with one side bent inward as if something heavy had struck it years earlier. Ronan turned the camera toward it while carefully lifting the lid, which opened with a dry scraping sound. Inside the box were several folded papers wrapped in a thin plastic sleeve that had yellowed with age. There was also a small flashlight and what appeared to be an old cassette tape. Ronan pulled the papers out first and unfolded them while kneeling in the dust beside the canyon wall. The camera footage shook slightly as he adjusted his position to read the faded writing. The pages contained handwritten notes filled with rough sketches of the canyon and short lines of hurried instructions. One sentence appeared several times across the pages, written in thicker ink than the rest. It said, "Stay out of the narrow passage after the second bend." Ronan glanced up toward the trail ahead, where the canyon curved sharply out of view about 30 yards away. That bend matched the rough drawing on the paper almost perfectly. Another page described strange sounds echoing through the canyon at night, though the details were incomplete and difficult to read. The final page contained a short message that seemed written in a rush. It read, "If we do not come back, warn anyone who finds this." For a moment, Ronan simply stared at the paper while the wind pushed loose sand along the canyon floor. The quiet surroundings suddenly felt heavier, as if the walls around him were closing in slowly. He folded the papers again and placed them back inside the plastic sleeve before returning them to the metal box. Then he stood up and looked once more toward the bend, farther down the trail. The sunlight barely reached that section of canyon now, leaving the path ahead covered in long shadows. From where he stood, the narrow passage looked darker than the rest of the trail behind him. Ronan hesitated while considering whether the warnings were part of an elaborate prank or something more serious. Eventually, curiosity won again, and he decided to walk a little farther just to see what lay beyond the bend. He lifted the camera and continued down the path while recording everything around him in steady silence. The canyon grew noticeably tighter as he approached the place marked on the old map inside the metal box. Then, just before reaching the bend, Ronan stopped suddenly. Something else had been carved into the stone at eye level along the right side of the canyon wall. But this carving looked very different from the earlier warnings. Instead of words, the stone showed several deep vertical marks lined closely beside each other. Each mark was nearly a foot long and cut much deeper than any of the messages Ronan had already seen. The camera moved closer as Ronan leaned toward the strange markings for a better look. That was when a faint sound echoed somewhere beyond the bend ahead. At first, it was so quiet the camera microphone barely captured it. But Ronan heard it clearly enough to freeze where he stood. It sounded like a single rock sliding slowly across stone somewhere deeper inside the canyon. Ronan Hale remained completely still after hearing the faint sound echo through the narrow canyon corridor. For several seconds, the camera recorded nothing but the quiet wind moving dust across the rocky ground. He slowly turned his head toward the bend ahead, listening carefully for any sign that something else was moving nearby. The canyon remained silent, though the long walls around him carried even the smallest sound surprisingly far. Ronan whispered that it was probably a small animal knocking loose stones somewhere deeper along the trail. Still, his voice sounded less certain than it had earlier during the hike. He took a few cautious steps toward the bend while holding the camera steady in front of him. The strange vertical markings in the rock remained visible behind him as the path curved out of sight. Those marks would later become one of the most discussed details once investigators reviewed the footage. Each line looked sharp and deliberate, though no tool marks could be clearly identified in the video. When Ronan reached the bend, he paused again and slowly angled the camera around the corner first. The narrow passage opened into a slightly wider section of canyon covered with scattered stones and fallen debris. Nothing moved inside the open space at first glance. The ground looked uneven and sloped gently downward toward another darker corridor farther ahead. Ronan stepped forward carefully and continued recording as he walked into the wider clearing between the canyon walls. A few seconds later, the camera tilted suddenly toward the ground. Part of a human boot appeared in the dust several feet away near the base of the opposite wall. The rest of the shape slowly came into view as Ronan approached. Half buried beneath loose gravel was the skeletal outline of a hiking pack and what remained of a person beside it. The bones were scattered slightly, as if they had been exposed to years of harsh weather. Ronan stopped immediately and lowered the camera while staring at the discovery in stunned silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded quiet and shaken. He said someone must have gotten lost here a long time ago and never found their way back out. Then, he carefully stepped closer to examine the abandoned gear lying beside the remains. The backpack looked extremely old, with faded straps and cracked plastic buckles coated in thick canyon dust. Ronan noticed a small metal tag attached to one of the zippers. He brushed it clean with his thumb and read the faint lettering engraved across its surface. The tag carried a name and a year that had nearly worn away. The camera struggled to focus, but investigators later enhanced the frame during their analysis of the footage. The tag appeared to read a name, followed by the year 1998. That discovery matched the age of the rusted metal box Ronan had found earlier along the trail. It also matched the style of handwriting on the warning notes stored inside the plastic sleeve. For a moment, Ronan looked back toward the direction he had come from earlier that afternoon. The narrow bend now seemed much farther away than it had only minutes before. Then, another sound echoed faintly through the canyon behind him. This time, the noise was clearer than before and lasted slightly longer. It sounded like several small stones sliding down rock somewhere along the path Ronan had already walked. The camera shifted as he turned quickly toward the sound. The trail behind him remained empty. But dust drifted slowly in the air near the bend as if something had just moved through the passage. Ronan stared in that direction for several long seconds without speaking. Finally, he backed away from the skeletal remains and began walking toward the bend again. His footsteps grew faster as he returned along the narrow trail that led back toward the carved warnings. The camera footage shook more with each step as he moved through the tight canyon corridor. When Ronan reached the second carved message, he paused only briefly before continuing toward the first warning. The sunlight near the entrance of the canyon now appeared brighter than before. The last clear video clip ended as Ronan approached the original carved sentence in the canyon wall. The camera pointed directly at the words, telling hikers to turn back while they still could. The recording stopped abruptly a few seconds later. No further footage was found on the camera. Ronan Hale returned home later that evening and reported the discovery to local authorities the next morning. Search teams later recovered the remains inside the canyon and confirmed the person had died many years earlier. Investigators concluded the warnings were likely carved by members of an earlier hiking group searching for their missing friend. The metal box and written notes appeared to have been left as a final attempt to warn others. But one detail from Ronan's footage was never fully explained by those investigators. The drifting dust near the canyon bend suggested something had moved there moments before he looked back. Ronan himself later admitted he never returned to that trail again. He said the warnings had done exactly what they were meant to do. They made sure the next person who found them chose to leave.